You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Hello everyone and welcome back to episode 187 of Arsenal Pass. This week on the pod, me and Pankaj, we're back from Japan and we're here to talk all things banned and restricted. I guess first thing I want to ask you, Pankaj, is what was your initial thought? Actually, you kind of just said it to me, but I was like, I'll quickly hit record and you can tell me your initial thoughts on the banned and restricted, because we did speak on the pod last week while we were in Japan. We gave our predictions. We both agreed Octane banned, right? But we disagreed.
That was confirmed.
Yeah, confirmed. But we both disagreed on Count Your Blessings, and it looks like we were both kind of right.
Yeah, you thought it wouldn't be banned at all, and I thought it would be banned not because of power level, but because of coverage reasons. But yeah, they seem to have done some sort of partial ban here, just banning the blues. And my initial thoughts when I first saw it, like just my personal take before discussing it with anyone, before doing any testing, my personal take was like, oh, they killed all 9 copies by just banning the blues. That was my take. But I've been hearing, and apparently in testing, it's coming out that it's actually still real, not as potent as it used to be, obviously, but Count Your Blessing still exists. Mm-hmm. So that's quite interesting. Definitely a partial ban for sure then. Yeah,
we'll talk about that in the main topic of the pod. Yeah, I mean, how was your travels back? You were telling me before you're feeling a little bit on the jet lag side.
Yeah, I'm still jet lagged. The time difference between Seattle and Japan is quite a lot. I don't even know the number, but it's like above 12 or something. I guess above 12 doesn't really matter, but it's at least 12.
Yeah, because then it's like negative, right? That's the tipping point.
Yeah, it just goes the other way. Yeah, but it's a significant amount. So yeah, I'm still jet lagged. Woke up at like 5 a.m. Not on my own accord this morning. So, and it's evening right now, so I'm just gonna try not to yawn too much during this episode, basically.
That's fair. I mean, I did wake up at 5 a.m. of my own accord to go for a run, but it's only midday for me, or just after, and it's getting quite late for you. So. I'll give you that one. I guess before we get into this week in Flesh and Blood, I guess what I wanted to ask you is, now that you are back from Japan, any more reflections on Worlds itself or your trip or anything like that? I mean, for me, it was an awesome trip. Worlds is great. It's good to be home though.
I miss Japan a lot. That was my first time in Japan. It was definitely the country I wanted to visit the most out of any place, so it was great to be able to go visit there, and I definitely still miss it. The food is amazing, just the vibes, the atmosphere was, it was electric, and it was just stellar. I was already missing it the moment I got on the flight back home.
Yeah, well, calling Kobe, you could get there.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a little far for just calling. So. Yeah.
In fact, not only am I sure, I just know that we're going to be back there in the not too distant future for a pro tour. It's just going to happen, right? The Japanese market's a big target market for LSS. I think if it's not in the next year or two, 3-4 years, I think we'll be back there.
Oh, I thought you were straight up predicting that PT APAC next year is in Japan. Got some inside info there? It just.
I got no inside info. If I had to guess where APAC, if I had to put my chips down where I think the APAC Pro Tour is next year, I would say Singapore. I think, you're at the first ever Singapore calling. James all but promised a Pro Tour in Singapore during his welcome speech to happen in the coming few years. And I think, community-wise, it would make the most sense. I think, the other obvious kind of locations, I guess, would be places like Hong Kong or even a return to Taiwan. But I think Singapore's got to be top of the list.
I think it was my primary guess as well. Again, no inside information. I'm surprised not many people are guessing either Australia or New Zealand as like a second option, like after Singapore. Most people are just like, nah, it's like not really gonna be there. People would guess like Hong Kong before Singapore, and I found that a little bit surprising, given it's the home of Flesh and Blood, home of LSS.
Yeah. I guess it comes down to numbers, a numbers game, right? And especially if the calling is a moneymaker to an extent. Well, it helps them float the world tour, as we'll talk about very soon, events. And you want to make sure that you're getting good return on your numbers. I think it was about 500 odd in Osaka for the calling.
I think so. around that.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where they want to be for those callings. And I think if you head to New Zealand, not only will the Pro Tour probably be smaller, the calling's going to be smaller. And I think Australia is on that fringe. It's hard to travel to Australia, honestly, from a lot of places in the world. Like from your end, it's it's actually not too far, right? Like relative scheme of things. But Europe is insane. It's much easier to travel to true Asia. So yeah, we'll see.
Makes sense. So moving on to this week in Flesh and Blood, we obviously just got back from World Championships. However, prep, at least for me, hasn't ended, and for a lot of my testing group as well, because Calling Portland is next weekend, and a bunch of the people I was testing with are going. I mean, obviously my locals are going. It's not local to us, as few as also the other testing group members. So yeah, it came back, and I've just been grinding some new again. How about you? How's your week been?
We're on the real. So are you playing new for Portland? Like that's locked in?
Yeah. Just I've mentioned it so many times before on pods, and just in general, my advice to people: just if you have the deck that you're most comfortable with and the one you have most fun playing, it's just better to be on that rather than trying to chase the meta or something. I think I'm just gonna, regardless of what the best deck is or how well positioned she is, just based on my own experience and familiarity with the deck, that would be the one I'll be able to perform the best on.
Yeah, I feel like we've talked about this topic a few times over the last few weeks, and we even broke it down to head versus heart a few weeks ago. And I think that one might be a little bit different because that head versus heart might come down to, oh, do I play Bolton or do I play this other deck that is a top tier that I've been versed in. Whereas you're talking about just true familiarity while also picking something that, I mean, we'll talk about in the pod, but the main topic in terms of where the meta kind of shakes out with the BNR, but Nu was good heading into the PT. It made a top 8 at the PT. It performed fairly well, and I think it's a strong hero. I think all the MSD heroes are very strong, so I think you can't really go wrong picking any of those heroes. It's not like you're out here saying, yeah, we're locking in Tekla Vossen for Portland.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I would love to play Kasai, which is another hero that I have familiarity with and have a lot of fun playing, yeah, she's just unplayable. So yeah, I'm on Nu.
Yeah, there you go. Well, for me, 4 days back? I don't have any events until I've got no events really for the rest of the year. I might play a couple of smaller events. I guess that's kind of going to be all for me. So I actually have been indulging myself with a little bit of another card game, so to speak. I've been playing. Have you heard about the Bazaar?
Oh yeah, I really want to play it, but because I'm trying. I haven't bought it yet. I haven't bought the closed beta access yet because I know if I buy it, it'll take away from my prep time. So I was just like, let's just wait until after the calling, and then I can
get into it. Shout out to.
How's it been for you?
Yeah, I mean, shout out to my friend David Marshall, who was part of our testing group for PT. Maybe the day before the PT. He's like, oh. We're like in Osaka, he's like, oh, the Bazaar, like the early access, the beta is just open. He's like, I'm gonna play some, and then he had like a spare code, so he flicked it my way, and I've been really enjoying it. Yeah, I think, it's beta, right? There's definitely bugs and things happening with the game, but I love this kind of like early Hearthstone-esque mixed with kind of the adventure side of it, and I think the game's pretty cool. If you haven't seen it, I think it's worth going and checking out a couple of videos on YouTube. I don't know what this game will become once it gets out of beta, and what the kind of pay to play aspects of it will look like down the road. But yeah, I think this or what the kind of ranking systems, etc., will look like down the road. But I think the game's fun, and I'm always looking for fun bite-sized games that I can kind of I'd say Slay the Spire has been a good one for that kind of thing. All these kind of games that are going to be bite-sized, you can come back to in and out of. I mean, Hearthstone was that for me a few years ago. I think these are always nice to have. So yeah, enjoying it.
I have watched some videos on it, and I'm super excited to get into it for sure. I've also been hearing a lot of people close to me, like people who enjoy the sort of games that I enjoy, really giving this game a lot of praise. So I'm looking forward to finally being able to play it.
Yeah. With that said, let's get into the news. And I think we've got to start with the obvious one, of course. Banned and restricted. We kind of spoke about it at the top of the pod, but the big news is High Octane banned. I mean, is that the big news? I guess we were expecting High Octane banned. We basically, said that it had all been confirmed from LSS already that High Octane was going to be banned. And then Count Your Blessings Blue is the choice of ban that they go with. So that kind of, will it be banned? Won't it be banned? Well, how about some and some? And if you haven't read kind of the explanation on these ban and restricted announcements when it comes to Classic Constructed, we'll talk about others in a second. The reasoning for High Octane, you can go and listen to the Dev Download podcast that LSS do from I want to say it was the book banning one, right? So it was September October edition, and Brian Gottlieb talks a lot about why High Octane is on the chopping block, and they basically reiterate all of those points in this article. And the reasoning, I guess, the big reason for Count Your Blessings is that they think that, well, in particular, they talk about Count Your Blessings and Enigma being the kind of control decks they want to see in the game, but there maybe not being quite the right answers right now for Count Your Blessings, and so for the time being, Count Your Blessings Blue gets the ban. Yeah, I mean, you said to me, Pankaj, that your first reaction was that it's dead. I mean, even in the article, they kind of point to maybe it just being a slight nerf rather than it being dead, right?
And aside from just right now, maybe a slight nerf, they heavily hinted that it'll probably come back one day. And they also hinted at other, tech cards, like already, the Hunted preview with Jagged Edge. There's more tech cards across the board for different classes. So aside from just the bannings, we also got a few hints at the end of the article, which is super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, they state, and I quote, fundamentally, I don't think Count Your Blessings is a problem. This card is returning, right? In all 9 copies. It's just a matter of when, not if. And if the tech cards are there in the Hunted, then it could be as early as next set, right? Or it could be, a year down the track or even longer. So, yeah, I thought it was quite interesting to see. And they specifically cite the examples of, having access to cards like Poison the Well, for instance, and the counters that exist to that. And, maybe cards, they don't talk about these ones, but obviously there's things like Gravekeeping. There's the Amulet from Everfest.
Amulet of Echoes, right?
No.
No.
It's not actually called Amulet. It's called Talisman?
Yeah, the one where you get to banish stuff from the graveyard. Yes,
yeah.
I forget what it's called.
The card that no one thought about until Count Your Blessings came about, basically. So yeah, we'll see. And then just quickly, a few other changes, outside of Classic Constructed Blitz. So as promised by LSS, Zen is no longer Living Legend status. Belittle is banned and Hadron Collider is banned. Any thoughts on those two, Pankaj? Belittle is a very powerful card that has probably been the most powerful card that's been sitting around in Blitz for some time. You think this makes sense?
I think Stormstride is the most powerful card in Blitz, and it's kind of, I don't know whether we can count equipment there. Now, I don't have too much familiarity with the Blitz format, so I can't say how this will affect it, but I have to say, I thought Belittle was already banned.
A lot of people have said this.
I thought it was, yeah, it's such a powerful card in such a, short game format, and Chain exists, and Chain is insane. So I was like, I actually thought it was already banned. So when I saw that, I was like, interesting. It just goes to show, that's not really a format I engage with very much.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a reason for that. I think, when we were even as far back as Amsterdam, right? James White spoke about what the Blitz format is and maybe their unhappiness with the Blitz format. And they spoke about it on the dev download more. They talked about it more in Osaka as well. I don't think this is a small step. The Zen, the change in Living Legend points, some of these bannings. Hadron Collider, if you want to see this one, why this was banned, basically this is a nerf to Data Doll, specifically.
Yeah, I've heard Data Doll does dirty things.
Yeah, which is crazy that Data Doll became one of the premier decks in Blitz, and they're like, nope, get it out of here. The meme is dead. But I think we're going to see Blitz even evolve further and further, and I think it has to. So it's going to be interesting to see where Blitz goes next.
Speaking of Blitz, shout out to Brody Spurlock for winning a Blitz PQ Plus this past weekend in Hiroshima. He won it on Levia, actually. And then the Battle Hardened that was, I don't say attached to it, PQ Plus attached to Battle Hardened.
Yeah.
Whatever, the Battle Hardened was happening the same weekend. I believe won by Michael Fung on Enigma. So the two min-max guys taking that an entire weekend.
Did he get his last licks in with Count Your Blessings, or not so much?
I haven't looked at the list. I think it was a Count Your Blessings list, but I can't say for sure.
Yeah, interesting. And then Living Legend, Open the Floodgates is restricted. We obviously saw Kano win the Living Legend Battle Hardened attached to the Osaka World Championships. And I think this makes a lot of sense. This card is particularly insane when you still have access to all of your tomes and your wildfires. And it's pretty insane that the kind of small window that we've had for this. To be fair, we haven't had that much Living Legend events, I guess. But Kano very, very strong in that format, and still very strong even after this. And then Starstruck is unrestricted, which I think makes sense. I'm not even sure that the Starvo decks are even particularly that excited about Starstruck. So I don't know, makes sense.
Yeah, I think they have so many new tools now,
Yeah.
especially after Rosetta, but I'm not entirely sure that they run that card. On the Open the Floodgates, though, yeah, it's like Kano's running around with 15 tomes in the deck, 9 of them that deal damage. It's kind of,
yeah,
it was pretty cracked. Do you know the story of that finals, by the way, the Battle finals in Osaka? It was Peter Burancic and Kano against CYB Oldham.
Yeah, playing against Xavier. I heard the game didn't play.
Yeah, it didn't play because Xavier just asked Peter, "Are you gonna stack me?" And Peter said yes. And Xavier was like, "I believe you're a good enough player to not mess it up, so you can have the win." And then they just walked out. that was the Battle final.
Because this may be unsubstantiated, but I might have heard that they played in Swiss and Peter lost.
Yes,
yeah, so
yeah. I mean, who knows? But yeah.
That's pretty funny. Lastly, Commoner, Aether Ironweaver's banned. From what I heard, that card was pretty egregious to what Chain was able to do in Commoner and taking a lot of gold foils, it seems, in these Commoner events. So goodbye, Aether Ironweave. Finally, the next ban restrict announcement will be on Monday, December 16th. I can't imagine we're going to see a lot of changes there, but we'll wait and see what happens over the next few weeks with calling Portland and KL, and we're going to talk about some of the newness coming in for KL with Jarl. So we'll get to that. Maybe we'll see something happen.
Calling Florence as well. I think that's this weekend.
Oh, that's this weekend. Oh, right. Yes, you're right. It is too. There you go.
Yes.
This is why you're here to remind me.
3 or 4 callings. Yeah.
A couple of weeks ago, we had a giveaway for Portland calling. I actually already commented on this person's comment to let them know that they had won, and I haven't heard from them as of yet. So if you are Schickelberg, make sure you get in touch with us at arsenalpassfab@gmail.com, because your comment to the question, what was the question again, Pankaj?
Right, it was, what is Hayden going to take to Worlds? Wrong answers only.
Yes, and Schickelberg said, Hayden has figured out a secret tech that makes Rock Rhinar viable, and as such will be bringing the green man himself. Rock will win Worlds. I really, really wish this is true. I wish I could play Rock. I wish I could play Rhinar. Obviously, I played CYB Enigma, so... but you are our winner for the entry to the Portland calling giveaway, so if you want to give us an email, ASAP, we'll make sure you set up with that.
I actually forgot Rock existed until I read this comment, and now I'm disappointed that you didn't bring Rock to Worlds.
One day I'll bring Rock to an event. Talk about a few other things in the news. We haven't talked about Jarl. We didn't get a chance last week because we obviously were wrapping up Worlds, and you know that was kind of a new announcement. Is this Jarl, this Armory deck that's coming? What are your kind of thoughts on first seeing Jarl and some of the cards involved here?
So my first thoughts on the weapon. Firstly, I think the flavor is really cool. We haven't seen a mechanic like this, the heavy flavor, which means you can play it as a one-handed or a two-handed, and that can mean you either equip it from the beginning as like a two-handed, or you start with like something like Stalagmite, an offhand that breaks, and then after, as the game goes on, your offhand breaks, and now you have a two-handed weapon. It switches to being heavy, and you get the +2 on it, which is really, really cool flavor-wise, right? You're like walking out with this pole arm, you swing it one-handed for first after the battle, and you switch to like two-handed, and it hits for harder. I think the flavor is really cool. The strength of it, I'm quite skeptical. My take with defensive slanted heroes that have disruption tackled on them is that they really need a good onboard one-card play. And that's actually my bit of a tangent here. That's my issue with Verdance as well, and I think why she's not very strong, is that not having an onboard one-card play just cripples a lot of your blocking decisions, right? A lot of times you disrupt your opponent, they're on like a smaller hand size, they don't send back enough damage at you, and because you're a defensive slanted deck and you have all these blues, you draw a hand that's not very offensive, and you're kind of stuck in some situations where you want to block with 3 cards, but your hand does nothing on 1 card because you don't have like a Frosty Hammer or something to use it on, right? I mean, like, if you think about the historic heroes that were defensively slanted, they had amazing 1-card plays. Obviously, Winter's Wail and Carnet Peak being the 2 really, really good ones that stand out. I mean, even Florin, he's got Grasp into Sword, which is really, really good. But this doesn't have that. That's a big problem. And Jarl, if he isn't running Carnet Peak, doesn't have that with his weapon either.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see where the builds of him go. I think that's a serious problem that needs to be solved.
That was my question. I mean, Coronet Peak, is that not the answer to the problem that you're kind of putting forward here?
Yeah, I think so. But then you're giving up on Summit. I forget the name of the headpiece. I know it says it has Summit in it. That card seems really, really strong. I think having like 2 stalagmites on the field, basically. I guess that one's 1 use compared to stalagmite.
Oh, the ice cap.
Very, very strong.
Golden ice cap. Yeah.
Yeah. You will have to sacrifice that, which I think is probably fine. But yeah, I could totally see Coronet Peak being the headpiece of choice because it will solve that problem. But I understand there's a lot of skepticism around it as well. So we're gonna have to see. What are your thoughts on your?
It's interesting. I feel like I'm hearing, it's so polarizing, either unplayable or very, very good and going to bust open the format in some way, shape, or form. And it's interesting it's obviously not Ultim, right? But if you look back when Ultim first came out, people could not figure out that hero for a couple of months. It released, Briar dominated that meta. Even though Ultim was a fantastic counter to it eventually once people worked it out. We saw Michael Hamilton win that calling attached to the US Nationals that year that it came out. And I don't think Jarl is at that level where it's like, oh, actually this hero is going to be very, very strong. It's going to be, offensive. And it's actually going to, break open the format. But I do think it is actually quite strong. I think whenever you pair 2 talents and a class, it can't be weak. And you say, well, how good is this hero ability? And yeah, sure. I mean, that is a fair question. Like, how do you leverage that? But still, 2 talents, a class, 40 health, 4 intellect. I think it's going to have an impact on the format, which we can talk a little bit more about. But yeah, I think it's cool to see this product, and I'm excited to see what happens for. So KL, I think, is going to be the first time we'll see this because it comes out the Friday after Portland, the Friday before KL. So that'll be the first time we get to see it in action at a calling. So yeah, I'm excited to see what happens.
We have definitely seen a strong correlation between the depth of the card pool and how strong the hero is. Right, I think like Lexi was a great example of that as well, and I mean Odin before that as well. Like all those dual talent heroes and Briar, yeah, just the dual talent heroes, how strong they've been just from sheer depth of card pool available to them. And of course, he also has a Guardian pool, which is a whole bunch of strong cards, and the equipment suite, right, with having ice, with the new ice cards that are showing up. Like you have Stalagmite and the Peak that we were talking about. It does seem like on the surface it'd be very, very strong. I wouldn't be surprised if he has a strong impact as well. I just imagine it'll be more on the end of he's like changing the way aggro decks have to be built. Yes. Like the Redline Visceralist, for example, maybe just can't exist anymore. Like on that kind of front, I'll be curious to see about how that actually converts to results.
Yeah, agree. I mean, hypothermia is legal right now.
Yeah.
We'll see. Last 2, just quickly, if you haven't seen already, over on fabtcg.com, the announcement of, and this was talked about at Osaka, but the World Tour and the sort of rebranding of LSS and Flesh and Blood's premier event schedule. A lot has been released for kind of next year. Also, this World Tour points will have an effective player of the year, which is very interesting. And then the Hunted, we spoke a little bit about last week. I think we're going to see more information on the Hunted as we go through these first, these next 3 callings. Rather, I'm sure we'll see some spoilers and previews as we head towards January next year, where we'll see the release of that set. So, all good things.
And sometime in December, we're going to see the Arachne stuff, right? That
yes.
That was a hint that we're going to see what Chaos means in December. I'm really looking forward to that one. So moving on to our Command and Cookout section, we have a question from Brendan. Also goes by Huckler, I think. The question is, I'm someone who is significantly more interested in playing off-meta rogue decks that require and reward high skill rather than just playing the best deck in format at any given time. For example, in Magic, I was a dedicated Lantern control player for several years because it required me to know my opponent's deck as well as, or better, than my own. Do you think Fab has a spot for players like me? And if so, where's that spot? Or what decks fit this type of player?
It's a good question. I think, to Brandon's question here, I actually think there's a lot of similarities between Magic, particularly, not so much with, I would say, Standard, and Brandon's not talking about Standard here, referencing this particular deck, this Lantern Control deck. That was an extended and then modern deck that was quite popular. I think, yes. I think the hero-centric game design really allows for this. I think it ebbs and flows, though, as it did, and it has in other games, and particularly in Magic, where, yeah, sometimes your deck was in a good spot, and sometimes it wasn't. And you are going to find times where classes, but particularly heroes, are just not going to be viable for whatever reason, in terms of where the meta's shaked out. But what I would say is that what you are going to find is that there's always an angle. Like, you can always find things. I mean, like we can take a very recent example. There's a lot of examples of this, but a very recent example of a class and hero not particularly well positioned, right, would be Bravo. And then we see a 5-0 Bravo, the day one of the World Championships. And some of that is going to come down to a little bit of matchup luck, but some of it comes down to just picking your lanes and working out, okay, maybe my class doesn't line up well into one of the top 2 heroes or classes, but I can target everything else, and I'm going to build my deck in that way. So yeah, I think there is a lot of this. And then if you go even, I guess, down the rabbit hole, I know you maybe want to talk about Azuri, but I think there's been other examples. Like, I would say Azuri winning PT in Amsterdam, Azuri was actually a good choice for that event, regardless of whether it's someone's pet deck or not. But I think you were seeing, even something like Dory consistently put up results across events, and its time was definitely in LA, right? But even at this World Championship, we saw some people have some success on Dory in the constructed portion. We've seen it at nationals level. I think if your hero is halfway decent, which 80% of the heroes I think are anyway, you're going to be able to pick a lane each time that you go into constructed format or to a new format and build for that hero and be able to cater towards it. And I think rather, Brandon's talking about know your opponent's deck with lane control. Actually, what you need to understand is when it comes to being a specialist is understanding what the meta is going to look like and all the cards at your disposal to build a strategy for that meta. But yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts, Pankaj?
So my answer is also yes, but I'm less positive than you are on that. I guess, like, for me, it's like yes with an asterisk, and that if the question is, if you are a player like this that likes to play off-meta rogue decks, is there space in Fab for you? The answer is 100% yes. If your question is Fab the sort of game where I can always play just this one hero and still perform, I'm gonna be a lot more hesitant about that one. So my answer to this is more like, for that style of player, you want to play Dark Horse decks, and you want to specialize in those kind of strategies, like, definitely yes, but you need a breadth of potential heroes to choose from. Like, I was talking, like, I alluded to this earlier, right? I would love to play Kasai, but there's no way in this meta I'm going to show up with Kasai when there's a whole bunch of Rune Blades and Enigmas running around.
Yeah.
It's not happening. Like, I could be a Kasai specialist, and it's still just, it's not going to work. But, for example, Shoma, the previous PT, like, yeah, you do mention Azuri was strong, but I would still say she was off meta and rogue, right? Like, no one was talking about her. So many people just weren't even, like, practicing against her and stuff. So, like, that's an incredible example of how you can take a Dark Horse deck and, yeah, win an entire tier 4 event. So, yeah, if you are the type of player that wants to play Dark Horse heroes, 100%. Fab is amazing for that, actually. I think Fab rewards specialists, like, incredibly well. If you're a sort of player that only wants to play one deck or one class every single time, I'm less positive about that one.
I actually agree. I think I guess the difference I have to Brandon's question is I think that I don't think that was even the case in Magic. Like, I don't think that you could be a specialist in Magic the Gathering and always perform, because you would just show up and it's like, okay, I'm trying to use a Fab example, but if you've ever played Magic, there was a lot of decks that utilized the graveyard for recursion and resurrection and things like this. And so if you had a deck that happened to use the graveyard as its kind of source of power, and another deck that used the graveyard as a source of power was really popular or really big, for instance, you would get splash hate, right? Hit you. A good example of this probably is, maybe a lot of prevention effects to maybe target Enigma, and then you want to play Prism, and you're getting hit with the splash damage of that. It's not, people aren't out to kill Prism, they're out to kill Enigma, but by proxy, you're going to get hit with that, right? Or if I use an example of my dear Reiner, you want to play Reiner, you're a Reiner specialist, but actually all these people are changing to very aggressive wide aggro decks to counter other strategies, and it just happens to be your worst nightmare. I think that is kind of the challenge, and I think it's no different in between the two games. It's just it comes in a different form and takes a different shape. But yeah, I think in Fab you can definitely find these lanes, and I think to an extent you can do it with one hero, but you definitely cannot do it with one deck. Like, the deck is going to have to look different all the time, and sometimes it's just not going to be the time for that hero, even if you can find a particular strategy. But I do think you can build and shape ways to try and target him. I mean, there's a particular player in Australia who is like solo Reiner, only plays Reiner, right, and does very well, fairly consistently. Sam Sutherland has only ever played dash asterisk, i.e. until this PT, until this Worlds where he played IO, and has consistently done well, right? And I guess to my point earlier, I think that's off the strength obviously of Sam as a player being one of the best players in the world, but also that hero is just a good hero. Both those heroes are just good heroes. Whereas maybe if Sam was a Tickler-Vossen sort of ripper, maybe his despite how good he is, it might not have gone so well for him. So.
Yeah, I think there are certain classes / heroes that have a little more flexibility in the sort of strategies they're allowed to enact, right? I think Dash is a very, very good example of that. You can go the full turtle up sort of control-y strategy or full Hanabi Blaster. I'm just gonna boost your face. And the deck like can land somewhere in between or at those polar opposites as well. So that gives it a strength to perhaps be a deck that conforms to what Brendan's talking about here. I think Assassin's another good option as well, just because of the sheer breadth of like tech options that they have. You know, they like all these traps that they can have, which aren't really being played, but who knows? You know, like if warriors suddenly matter, you can play a frailty trap and stuff and completely mess them up. So I think certain classes, yeah, maybe, but yeah, I think we're both in agreement that having a breadth of potential heroes, potential dark horse heroes, is going to serve you a lot better than just trying to stick to one.
Agree. Cool.
Well, thank you for the question. If you want to leave your questions, you can go ahead and post the question either in the comments of this video or in the Discord, or come up to one of us at any event and just hand us a piece of paper with a question on it. That will work as well.
Which I got one of.
And with that,
I got a question.
Oh, you did?
I did. I got a handwritten question. Shout out to, I have it written down. It's not with me, but I believe he was from Poland. Come up and gave a question. So I have one for next week on the pod. A handwritten question all the way from the World Championships in Osaka for the Commander Cookout.
That is brilliant. What was it written on?
A Yu-Gi-Oh life pad, I think. Note, like a piece of sheet.
So, okay, so it's like a real piece of paper. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I'm expecting like some sort of napkin from a restaurant or something. So it's like a stain somewhere. And someone writes a question on it. Yeah. That would be amazing.
Stairway to heaven, like.
All right, so with that, we're going to move on to the main topic of the pod, where we're going to discuss the recent ban and restrictor announcement. Of course, we mentioned this at the top of the pod. High Octane and Blue Counter Blessings banned in the most recent update. So let's go ahead and start. Let's just start with talking about High Octane. I'll start the discussion off here.
Yeah, go for it.
And the first thing I want to say is that I think it makes me a bit sad. Is what I was feeling. Like, I completely get about the restricting future design space and things like that. I want to touch on a couple of things. The one thing is the flavor of the card, I think, was incredible. Just the fact that there were 3 different mechs that use this card, and they all use it so differently, right? There's OG Dash, who uses it, and then pays resources to load the gun and then fire the gun. There's Io, who needs to set up the gun counters first and then unload them all on one turn. And then there's Max, which is kind of similar to like the Io one, except his combo finish is even bigger and his setup was like even bigger. Like the class fantasy of mechanologists using the same tool all very, very differently, I think was super spot on. And kind of losing that makes me a little sad. And then there's also, just expanding on the Max part of it, there's an unfulfilled promise, right? Like, there's a whole bunch of Max fans that enjoy the hero and have come and, maybe bought into the hero or have really found love for the hero because of that aggro combo playstyle mix. And that's just been taken away from them before the hero was ever relevant, right? This isn't the same as, like, a ball lightning ban back in the day when Briar was really good, which was just, this is a slightly too good numbers, why is cards by banning it? This is, you're completely redefining the hero. The promise of which was never fulfilled. And, a lot of players fell in love with that, and then it just got taken away from them. So the combination of these two things, it makes me a bit sad.
Yeah, that last one was, I mean, first of all, pour one out for my boy Max, right? I've come very close to playing Max Nitro at a Tier 4 event before. Shout out to Matt Rogers for actually doing it. I think that this is so someone pointed out to me, like, it's like Katsu when they banned bonds, and actually it's not. It's significantly harder hitting because, at least with Katsu has had an identity before. It'll have an identity post as a ninja with a lot of other tools coming into it. We've not seen that open up for Max. Max has been a lot narrower. This High Octane has been a part of almost every single build. It didn't exist before High Octane. And you know what? I hold out hope that we're going to see cards for Max come through, and a new way to play Max, new thoughts, new innovations, maybe new weapon, new equipment, whatever it is, right? Something that comes through and helps Max either operate on a similar axis and makes the Nitro Mechanoid viable, or it's completely different, right? And plays into a lot of different things when it comes to Max. But I do think that this is, I think that second piece, I agree. The flavor, for sure. I mean, maybe I'm not as big a king of flavor. I did really like what High Octane brought to the game and the different ways it could be used. But I think that particularly that point around what it does for Max, and honestly, even if you're not a Max enjoyer, I just think that it's a little bit harsh on old Max. So yeah, unsure.
And I think the Katsu example is sort of kind of similar to what I was talking about with the ball lightning thing, where Katsu had Bonds, and like when Bonds got hit, Katsu took a massive like power level hit, but it doesn't redefine his strategy. Like, he's still a deck that cares about hitting and then getting like combo chains off. He just doesn't have a very powerful one anymore, but it's still sort of the core identity of the hero remains the same. Whereas for Max, this identity was kind of just taken away before it ever got a chance to be in the sunlight, to be in the spotlight, and that's a part which I think it's just sad. Like, that's the thing. Like, I don't like I said, like you can see the power of High Octane, and you can sort of agree with it kind of like needs to go with the whole offensive overlap thing they've been talking about. So I can't say, oh, this was a terrible ban. It just makes me a bit sad for players for whom this promise was never fulfilled. It wasn't like they got like Max was ever super relevant and was the best deck, and then they took it down. This was just, hey, this was how the hero was played for a long time. You fell in love with it. Well, too bad it's gone now before you ever got a chance to actually utilize it.
Yeah, I agree. I have and also actually, just lastly on Max, and we can move off Max, we could talk about, the impacts to IO and just the general IE as well, actually, and then just the general ban and restricted announcement of High Octane going. But I'm interested to see, because you could argue, okay, there's other ways to use Nitro Mechanoid. It doesn't need to be combo centric. You've got all these amazing equipment pieces. I think Max really needs something to bring it to the forefront. I think we're going to see that at some point in the development cycle of Fish and Blood. It'd be interesting. But that aside, I have a question for you, Pankaj, which is, do you think High Octane was actually the right card to ban? Or is this a card that's being banned for just long-term design space restrictions, like you say? Or actually, if LSS wanted to say, okay, down the road we'll ban High Octane, but for now we can balance it out, not hurt Max as much, maybe not hurt IE as much, and we can ban potentially another card. What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a great leading question to our next point, or at least what I want to bring up. I think the problem card was Processor, right? So Cerebral and Processor to me was the card that should be banned for several reasons. I think just it has several balancing knobs, and just one or two of them are just a bit too far, right? Like, it doesn't need to cost 0. Or it doesn't need to be blue, or it doesn't need to come in with 2 Steam counters. Like all these knobs are kind of just dialed a little bit too high. That if you just bring 1 or 2 of them down, I think it would have been fine. But also, I think very, very importantly, Processor is the one that seems to be the most misaligned with their new philosophy around offensive overlaps. If you look at the cards that were banned in the previous BNR, with all the books being banned, it was card draw, right? It was just there's a bunch of card draw effects that were banned, the tomes, the Art of Wars and stuff. And I feel like Processor is very much the one that's most in line with those cards. And so I think, to me, that is like the clear target, especially since, as we were just talking about, Octane's been legal for a while, and it just hasn't, like, Dash has been strong here and there, but it's never been oppressive. It's never been the level of, like, people talk about, like, Art of Wars and, like, Tome of Aetherwind in Kano or something, right? Whereas Processor, the moment it comes out, even non-high octane turns, you see that being cranked off the top. You're like, wait, that is insane.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, look, I can see the issues with high octane. I can see the long-term issues with high octane. That's kind of why I asked that. I think in the spot we're in right now, high octane is not the premier culprit, right? This is, to me, high octane and banning it is about offensive overlap. It's about the future of the game, and it's about aligning the game to where LSS wanted it to be. I think Cerebellum Process was a mistake. I don't think this card should have been printed, and I think there's a fair few people that would agree with that. But it's here, and I guess my question sitting in my head is like, okay, did this come down to a point of we're going to ban High Octane at some point? Why don't we ban it now rather than banning the new card that just came out in an Armory deck? And ultimately, that's kind of, at least in my head, I'm attributing that was some of the decision that was made, the reason behind the decision. And that's a business-based decision. And I think that kind of makes sense to a degree. I'm not angry about it. I'm not upset with LSS for making that decision if that is part of the reason why they made the decision. But, you know, I think maybe if that is the case, I would have hoped they would have said it. But I do think that this is me being selfish as an Inventor Extraordinaire player. I'm really sad to see High Octane go, but I'm already brewing with Inventor Extraordinaire without it, so I don't know.
I think this brings us to something I want to talk about, which is this conversation, this sort of harsh reality that us as competitive card game players kind of need to face, right? Like, we would wish that these decisions could be made purely around game balance and purely around gameplay. Like, if we could have our way, then ideal world, that's the way we want it. We're like, oh, process is the problem card. Let's get rid of that one, like, clearly. But as you said, it just came out an Armory product, and you can't be like, hey, we're banning this card from the new player product that we just put out. So I'm with you. Like, you can't be... So the harsh reality we have to face is that, you know, if they don't make these decisions with these business considerations in mind, we're not going to have a card game to play for very long. If they keep doing, if they like make a new product and ban stuff, right? It's like Dustblade keeps.
I was about to say, what about before the set came out?
Yeah, or I think it's similar to Traverse as well. Actually, I think this ban kind of reminded me a lot of Traverse as well, where it's just like Traverse is kind of clearly just overtuned. But they can't ban it because there's an extended art Coldfall and it's the debut release in Japan and everything. So they're like, okay, cool, we gotta hit the Bonds of Ancestry, we gotta hit the tomes. Again, it's like, you know, there was, as you said, like with High Octane, like with those tomes, there is a sentiment of, for the long-term health of the game, we need to do this anyway. But there's still very much that feeling of, all right, the business part of it, we do need to get rid of these cards, and that just... Again, like, yeah, can't be upset. It just makes me a bit sad, you know, just that we aren't in that ideal world where these decisions can be made purely from game balance. And they have to take these business considerations in mind if we want to continue to have a game to play.
Yeah, it's not black and white either. It's shades of grey, and it's a sliding scale, I think, as all things are, or most things are in life, and especially in this kind of world. You know, the one argument is, okay, they don't ban High Octane, they have to ban Cerebellum Processor, and actually maybe they also have to ban System Reset, because with High Octane available, it's still too powerful for instance. Or they need to, you know, it doesn't quite balance it out enough. Or, you know, then they ban Cerebellum Processor, then down the line they have to ban High Octane, but they want to unban Cerebellum. You know, there's all these other considerations that come on with it as well. It's not cut and dry, but yeah, I think you can cut this so many ways. I think obviously where we've landed is High Octane is banned, and I think what is interesting to me is what is the impact of this? Like, we talked about Max. I think that's pretty clear cut. The hero was already down in the dumps. It was, you know, a D, probably tier hero at best. But IO coming off as one of the best decks from this recent meta, and including the World Championships, plus Inventor Extraordinaire being one of the better decks, I would say, over just the history of Flesh and Blood, but it's had its time this year as well. Where do these two heroes land? And I don't know, let's start with Dash IO. How good is IO now?
I think IO is still real. Obviously, it took a hit on the power level side of things, but it's still real. What I'm most curious about for IO is where she goes with the weapon. Like, not being able to unload Symbiosis Shot with a High Octane makes it seem like you either need to consistently be using those shots on every time you put an item down, otherwise you're going to end the game with a couple of spare counters on your weapon, or you just change weapon entirely.
Tell us, sure.
Oh.
Hanabi Blaster.
Hanabi Blaster, right? And you mentioned you've been brewing a bunch of Dash IE. Is that the weapon you're looking at as well for that hero?
10,000%. I think the only reason that I was playing Pistol in Dash IE, Inventor Extraordinaire, is because High Octane was insane. It was one of the bit. So one of my favorite things to do in Flesh and Blood when I look at consideration for a hero or a class or deck building or brewing is like, what are the most powerful? So depending on whether let's just say I start with the hero. What are the most powerful cards this hero has access to? And if I sit down and look at Dash Inventor Extraordinaire, it's Spark of Genius, it's High Octane, as Teklo Core. I think those are the three most powerful cards that the hero had access to. So, okay, let's try and play with all three of these. And then what happens if we take one of those away and try and do something like Hanabi Blaster, right? Actually, it's just not as powerful. So, 100%. But I really like Hanabi Blaster. I think it's very powerful. I've always been maybe the number one fan of Hanabi Blaster over the past couple of years. Big advocate, put a lot of D-Techs out on it, played it at Nationals, built, part of building the deck that won New Zealand Nationals with Hanabi Blaster. So I think it's going to be potentially the premier weapon for Inventor Extraordinaire, and just, I don't know, pile a bunch of cards in your deck. I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, for IO, I think for IE, I can definitely see that being the premier weapon moving forward. For IO, I think it's a little more. There's a little bit more consideration because she also wants to have all these items, right? And if you draw a hand with one item in it, I feel like it's already so hard for you to get, for you to reach the what's it called? The requirement of playing 3 boost cards, especially if you already also need to pitch for some of those boost cards, right? So just drawing a single item in a deck that's running like 15 to 18 items, like I feel like it's gonna happen. So how often can you actually get the counter on the Hanabi Blaster? And you have to do it twice before you can fire with it. So there are some questions to be answered there. You can't just take the existing deck and swap out the weapon and be like, okay, this works now. It will require other changes to it, and yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where that lands, if that even is a weapon, or maybe you just stick to Symbiosis Shot and you commit to a different game plan of trying to fire it at the end of every turn. And maybe some turns where you can't do it, you commit to at some point using your boots or finding a crank off the top, and those other turns where you unload an extra counter off the pistol.
I think that's probably most likely. I think if I had to put some money on it, I'd pretty safely bet that Hanabi Blaster is not going to be a weapon that IO plays, because just having played with a lot of Hanabi Blaster, it only takes us so for instance, if I use Inventor Extraordinaire, I tested Inventor Extraordinaire this season a little bit with like Cerebellum Processor, right? And even just adding that one extra item reduced the potency of Hanabi Blaster quite significantly. And yeah, you're right, 2 turns effectively to get it for 1 shot. If you aren't getting minimum 2, ideally 3, and in some matchups 4 shots out of your Hanabi Blaster, like it isn't good enough. And I don't think IO is going to be able to consistently get 2 attacks out of it. So I don't see that world really unfolding unless the deck changes significantly. So I think it's Symbiosis Shot. Or honestly, I think Talishar. It could be something more like that really for Hanabi Blaster. So
making yourself even more susceptible to fatigue. I could see it. Just kind of like raise the ceiling even higher.
Just go for it. To be fair, that is my question now, is like, how good is IO? And I think, yes, it's very good, right? That is my view. But I think you just kind of have to almost give up fatigue. Like, not in a way that I think you can fight against just incidental fatigue, for sure. I think we talked about penetration script in the 2 weeks leading up to this event being a phenomenal item. It had less impact in Worlds than I maybe would have expected. I still think that item is very, very strong, and I think you will see the impact of that item, I think even more so now, because there's a clear spot for it. So I think you can kind of build this natural immunity almost. You can build up to make sure you protect yourself against just incidental fatigue. Decks that just have a bunch of 3 blocks and maybe just pivot to fatigue you. But I think if someone sets out to really, they want to fatigue you, I think you're going to be hard pressed to be able to beat that. You already were, honestly.
Yeah, we already spoke about how that was Dashar's biggest problem going into World, right? That was always all right, you want to bring Dashar to Worlds, what's your plan for fatigue? And there was so many different options, right? There was a system reset plan, there was a plasma mainline stuff going on, the different options, but yeah, but High Octane was also a big part of it that was just gluing it all together. With this is the way I unload my pistol, and no deck can block like 5 pistol shots for 2 after a bunch of boosts, right? So yeah, there's a very tough problem to solve there. And yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe you just have to give it up. I'm also curious to see whether they can come up with interesting solutions. I mean, you did sort of get 3 slots in the deck, and they're cool. They're interesting items, right? I mean, going back to Hanabi Blaster, there's a megahertz script, which gives all your mech cards, mech attacks go again without needing to boost it. And the thing is, Hanabi Blaster doesn't specify that you need to boost. You need to play 3 boost cards. Yeah, so that's it could be too cute, but that's interesting. I think autosave script is also a curious one. Gives all your mech action cards the underloop text. And speaking of underloop text, underloop itself as well. Like, you have to wonder, maybe they start leaning into these other boost cards that, recur themselves and just preserve some threat density in the deck.
I agree. And I think the last thing that's particularly interesting for me on that is I think IO's ceiling has certainly dropped. I don't think the floor's dropped much though. And I think that is the thing that I think a lot of people should be thinking about in terms of what impact will it have next? What impact will IO have next? I think it is still one of the premier aggro decks, if not potentially just the premier aggro deck that just does the thing. At least it's contending with Aurora, etc. But yeah, what innovation can people bring to IO to potentially take a different avenue? There's still all these powerful cards. I spoke about what are the most powerful cards in Inventor Extraordinaire. Spark of Genius, Teklo Core, those cards are all still there. Plus, you have a really, really strong hero ability and a bunch of other really strong cards at your disposal. So how can you use them? I think is going to be interesting to me.
So with that, let's move on to talking about the other ban in the BNR announcement. So Count Your Blessings Blue. So you took CYB Enigma 2 Worlds. That was your pick. You did a last minute pivot, even though we spoke about 2 of your decks, which won't CYB Enigma, but that's all cool. That's fine.
I did say though, hey, I'm not gonna let that one stand. I'm not gonna let it slide.
I'm just giving you a hard time.
I did say 10% chance to play CYB Enigma. It just turned out that was like an 80% chance I played CYB Enigma, and that's what I did.
Yeah. All right. So anyway, so CYB Blues banned, and as someone who took CYB Enigma 2 Worlds, why don't you lead us off here? Lead us off here. What do you think the impact of this ban is going to be?
It's such an interesting ban. I think, first of all, I've got to give credit to LSS for being really innovative with how they utilize cycles for the BNR. We've seen restrictions and come into the game more. Obviously, we've seen that used in Living Legend to affect whatever effect you think that is. And I think interestingly, we haven't seen as much in Class Constructed. We have seen in the past, cycles be banned though. Autumn's Touch, right? Autumn's Touch. Was Autumn's Touch fully banned?
Yeah. Yeah, it was fully banned. That's the thing. The first time we saw just specific colors being banned was actually Bonds of Ancestry.
Bonds of Ancestry.
It was actually very, very recent. Yep. And it was something people have been asking for a lot. Be like, hey, LSS, will you ever ban just one color or just certain colors of the card? And for a long time, they avoided it. Obviously, it is kind of confusing for a new player, right? For example, be like, oh, no, you can't play that color, but you can play this color of the same card. They avoided for a long time. Bonds of Ancestry was the first time they're like, okay, we're just banning the blues and the yellows. And then now this is the second time we've ever seen that. So, I mean, I'm with you. I'm totally down for bans like this. I think even new players, like, sure, it's maybe just a slightly more complex than just saying this card's banned outright. But I think for what it does for the health of the game, I think it outweighs that just for me.
Yeah.
But of course, I'm an enfranchised player, so yeah, I'm kind of biased.
I like it. I think it's smart, and I think it just opens up more avenues, right? And I think the thing is I agree with what is stated in this, and we spoke about this last week. What is stated in this ban restrict announcement is that Count Your Blessings is fundamentally not a problem card in the game, and I do agree with that in terms of what it does. And again, I'll just harp on that if you just look at the math of Count Your Blessings, until you get to your 5th, 6th Count Your Blessings, you're at either parity or you're losing value on your cards. And I think the interesting thing about what this ban does is that that math doesn't change, except for the fact that you get less positive impact from your CYB into the later stages of the game. Blue being the weakest of them all, right? So you take your total amount of life gain ability down, but you take it from the lowest source in terms of your blues. And I think that is what is interesting to me, is that you potentially, I think what this does, it doesn't take away the impact that CYB can have on a game in terms of building a buffer of life that is really particularly strong against decks that want to set up. So if you give free turns to a deck that plays Count Your Blessings, they're still going to be able to gain life. They're still going to be able to raise the total amount of damage that you need to deal to be able to kill them with your non-interactive damage, which I really like, because non-interactive damage, I think, needs to have some sort of counter. And if that's life gain, it's life gain, right? But what it does do, I think, is eliminate this kind of almost, you can never find enough damage. And if I cite decks like Dash.io, I cite decks like Viserai, for instance, I think with the 9 copies of Count Your Blessings, there were points, or even Aurora, right? We saw this in the final of the PT. There comes to a point where it's like, there is too much life that you can't get through it with the cards in your deck. And I think that's what the banning of CYB kind of, the blue CYB kind of removes, is it doesn't remove necessarily the potency of what CYB does as a strategy, but it does remove a lot of this kind of tipping point of it just being too much life that you can never find a strategy to get through it, if that makes sense.
So you mentioned the math around the CYB, and also you mentioned that you don't really go positive until the 5th or 6th UIB. Right?
4th, sorry.
Which is why...
Is it 4th?
I believe it's more than... I mean, I guess your 4th UIB... If it's
depends how you use the resource.
It
depends on the color, it depends how you use the resource. It's generally between 4 and 6, around 4 and 6.
Yeah, so which is why my first take when I saw this was like,
It's
oh, they
dead,
killed the
banned.
card.
Yeah.
Because it was 7 through 9, which is where you're actually going above rate, where you're actually doing powerful things with 2 cards. That was my first take. And speaking of the math on this, just for people who don't know who haven't done the math, previously with all 9 copies of CYB, when you resolve all of them, that results in a total of 54 life gained over the course of the game. Now it's down to 30. It's just banning 3 of them brought it from 54 all the way down to 30. It's not just like it doesn't cut it in 1/3, right? And that's what we mean by the bulk of the life gain was in CYB 7 through 9, kind of regardless of the color. So yeah, so I'm just curious to see how this shakes up. That's why I was like, oh, they killed the card. But you seem to be pretty high on it. And I mean, I guess I've seen it a little, and I think it is a bit more real than I personally gave it credit for. But I'm not as convinced about how successful it's going to be, unless, and I think the big thing is, a lot of people have replaced those blue CYBs for Sigils of Solace, which weren't in their list previously. I think Gregor's had it, when on Worlds, obviously, but there's so many other CYB lists that weren't on Sigils of Solace. And so now if they've just put them in place of the blue CYBs, so they still have a very respectable amount of life gain, then I could see that sort of still being super effective. But without that, I don't know. I feel like just cutting the blues was quite a big hit.
It is big. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's going to be successful. I just don't think it's dead. I think they've eliminated a current issue that can be found with the power of CYB, and they've throttled it back, right? I still think there is a place for CYB. For instance, if Viserai or if IO is just the premier aggro deck in the format, or Viserai is the premier setup deck in the format, right? In terms of, this kind of combo-esque Viserai deck, or I think that then CYB has a place, right? If it's not relevant and it's a bunch of, you're seeing stuff like Florian and all this, then I don't know, maybe it's less relevant. Like, that card, in my opinion, sucks against Florian. So, like, I think it now goes from being, okay, how do you utilize this in a build, or how does this become kind of the premier win condition, quote unquote, in a control deck, to it being a tool to utilize. That's kind of what I think has happened to CYB now.
I'm so curious you brought up IO in that. Like, with Vistra, I completely agree. But IO, just based on the top 8 matches we saw of IO against CYB and Enigma, the game ended before the 6 CYB was even resolved, both times. So I'm just like, why? It feels like it shouldn't. It feels like the ban didn't affect that matchup at all, actually. Because of how fast Dio decks themselves, right? The game ends by like turn 7. So you're not resolving 6 CYBs, let alone 9. So like, why does this affect that one? I'm so curious why you brought up IO in that.
Yeah, I'm pretty steadfast on this one through our testing, because that was definitely my thought as well when I first tested the matchup. I think in the case of someone like Sam Sutherland's deck, where they have the combo, right? I think we saw that play out perfectly in round 14 or round 15, right? Because there's an extra round. The final round.
The Matt Rogers. The
Matt Rogers game, right?
Swiss.
Yeah. The last round was Swiss. Go and replicate that game. Because a lot of things had to go right for Sam in that game. I mean, he played it perfectly, right? But a lot of things had to go right. And I think the thing is all the games where Dash.io does the 20%er, or does the thing, and is able to boost through its deck, do these massive turns, almost no deck is beating that. Like, it's just an insane power level, right? But what I think we found in testing is that if you do not play CYB and your opponent doesn't draw that well as Dash.io, they can still win those games very, very easily. You play CYB, they do not win those games. And I think that is kind of the ultimate piece of it for me, is that, yes, they can boost through deck and they can find these things, but if you're able to build an extra layer of life buffer when they take these turns off to set up something like, a Pounder, or set up their Cerebellum Processor plus another Boom Grenade with a counter on it or something, if your punishment on the flip side is to come back with like an on-hit effect, sometimes they don't care. If your punishment is to play something like double Aura and try and set up your, the best Aura, by the way, Essence of Ancestry Body, right? If that is your turn, well, first of all, the Essence of Ancestry Body, they can actually kind of play around that a little bit by getting you to a point to crack your auras and then just pass the turn with another setup, for instance. But if you just purely gain life, it is so hard for them to play around that. So I think in my testing and from what we found, that is why that is literally one of the biggest reasons why I ended up on CYB, is just because when we tested that matchup and tried a lot of different ways to work around it, it was the most impactful tool in the games where IO just doesn't immediately obliterate you in the first 4 turns of the game.
I definitely agree with the what you said about if Dash Arrow does the nuts on you, it doesn't matter what build you're running or what cards you're running, you're just going to die. And the Sam Sutherland game against Matt Rogers was a very good example. But I think the Sam Sutherland game against Michael Hamilton in the top 8 was one of the examples of what I was talking about, where Michael Hamilton didn't get to resolve even 6 CYBs.
Sure, he's playing the wrong CYB deck though.
Sure. But in the other one would be like the Alan Lau versus Gregor's game, also in top 8, where Alan lost that one, but Gregor's didn't even resolve 6 CYBs. So like once again, I'm just kind of like, why does it matter that you lost 3 CYBs? You're unlikely to resolve more than 6 anyway in the matchup, win or lose.
Sure,
is the thing.
Like, got you.
He won against Alan Lau without it. Yeah, and then Michael Hamilton lost to Sam Sutherland without resolving 6 because the game just ends so fast and you're not going to find them.
That's why I agree with you, though. I think if you losing these 3 CYBs, it doesn't impact the potency of how good CYB is against Dash.io. I actually think if anything, it helps it because you won't draw blue ones.
You're playing real blocking cards.
Yeah, you'll draw blocking cards or you'll draw your sigil if that's what you replace it with. So I think, I think it has a place, and I think those decks where they're setup based or you get to punish them for trying to set up, or fatigue is your primary, I think they are going to be good. But I think just as a general tool to use, maybe for instance like Gregor's deck, I think that is where the biggest hitters come. And also something like what Michael Hamilton played, for instance, where he utilized that as a tool to pair with just a pure fatigue into some matchups, because he was just like, well, I'm just going to gain so much life and value, and pair that with taking cards from my opponent and playing really efficient games, that I'm just gonna fatigue them a lot of the time. And I think that is kind of gone now.
And also just hiding what you have. Right? I think that was really the CYB new list. I mean, we've seen this before with like Sigil of Solace and Guardians, for example, where they send a CNC at you, they're holding a card, and you're like, oh no, is it Pummel? And you play around a Pummel, and then they just gain 3 life, for example. Except this is kind of turbocharged. This is like, okay, I'm a new, I send a Surgical at you, and I'm holding 3 extra cards. Like, what are you going to play around? And they eventually don't play around anything, just let it hit, and then you just heal a bunch of life on top of that. I thought that was a very, very cool take on the hero.
Yep. No, I agree. Look, I'm being kind of hyperbolic in some way. Like, there's some really cool stuff here, and I think I am really passionate about that kind of I feel like I spent a lot of time on learning as much as I could around CYB, because it's like, this card sucks. Like, mathematically, this card is not good. And then the more we played, the better it was. And I was like, I need to understand this. So I think I really spent a lot of time taking a step back about... First, the other thing as well is when you talk about the value and the proposition of this. So let's say you have played 2 and you play a red 1, right? Okay, that's 5 life gained, but what are you doing with the extra resource? And when that's something like, using your footsteps, or maybe if you're using offensively, it's playing something like a Spares of Surreality, or it's the extra resource you needed from a 2 resource previously, that's going to be more efficient, right? And I think that is where the true math of CYB kind of can be hidden a little bit. So yeah, that's interesting. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think breakpoints is the other one. Breakpoints and sort of, you mentioned undirectable damage, like rune chants, for example, but even like weapons that are just not efficient for you to block, right? Like Starfall comes to mind, for example.
Yep.
There's a lot of like hidden value in Starfall just being difficult to block, and CYB just like counters that in the same like hidden value sense that you're talking about.
We want to, I guess, anything else to say on CYB, or anything else you want to talk about when it comes to ban restricted? Maybe meta, maybe what we think was going to happen in the next few weeks. Where do you want to kind of head from here?
Well, I don't want to talk about this. There isn't much to talk about it, but I really like the hint at the end about like more tech cards coming through.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, I've mentioned Kasai like 3 times already. Like, Jagged Edge got me excited. I was like, all right, please. I'm guessing she's still unplayable, to be honest, just because I don't think... It's kind of like how Chorus of Ironsong, right? The Dorinthia one didn't make Enigma playable, even though she got 3 extra copies.
Yeah.
Dory got 3 copies of the card. So probably not, and probably just still coping. But I think there's a general sentiment of having more of these tech cards coming through. Like, that's something they're like really working towards. I'm a big fan of, because I was never a big fan of just having these matchups that were just like, I'm supposed to go get lunch. And there's like nothing I could have done in deck building to have fixed this, right? Like the Guardian Illusionist thing, for example. It's like I would please give me some tools in deck building to at least make this matchup playable, so I can at least tailor my deck towards the meta. And so if I do end up with a lunch matchup, it's because I intentionally chose not to respect this. Yeah, like people are like, oh, I'm not going to respect Kano, for example. It's intentionally decided, rather than, oh, I'm playing this hero, therefore I don't have a choice. So that philosophy, that sentiment, I'm looking forward to.
I massively echo that. I think my challenge has been that, in my view, and me and Brendan actually talked about this, I think a couple of times, one at length on an episode, is that with the current design aspects and rules and some of the ways that just Flesh and Blood works, a lot of these silver bullets just do not have the impact that it seems on surface level they should, or that they're intended to have. And a lot of that is because of redundancy of effect in these said decks, or it is just because of pure force almost, right? Just how good these decks are. So if I use some examples, right? Snag against Chain, you can just play around it. Even Poison the Well against CYB Enigma, you can just play around it. So there is kind of like almost, you need some redundancy of these cards, but also they have to interact at almost a higher level. So, you know, for instance, you talked about Dorinthia, Kasai. If you have a lot of these warrior, so say you had like a critical massive attack reactions that just stop damage being prevented, then yes, you get the scenario you're talking about where I'm expecting a heavy Enigma or Prism meta, so I'm going to pile my deck with these cards at the expense of maybe the cards I need for another matchup, but it's going to help me in this. So like you say, I get to decide the launch matchup. I think there is going to be heroes where we get to with that very quickly, and there's going to be others where we don't get to, and I think generically, like for instance, Burdens of the Past is a card I find absolutely fascinating because in theory this should have some impact at some point in Flesh and Blood, same with Snag, but I just think that if you don't have the redundancy of the effect, you draw it at the wrong times, the card is going to be trash for forever and ever. So I don't know. But then in saying that, right, this Talisman of, I've forgotten the name, just became super relevant for some decks because of it, and no one knew what that card was. Some people can't even remember the name like me. So summon some.
Yeah.
Summon some.
Yeah, so completely agree with all that. Do we want to move on to talk about we say new meta. We don't really know how new it is. It still feels like a lot of just the previous meta, but just go over quickly over, maybe who won, who lost, and if there are new faces, who are they?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to just kind of quickly flick through them, right? Rather than, because I agree, I don't think the meta is overly changed. It's not had a facelift, but there's a few tweaks here and there, right?
Yeah. So I guess let's start with Viscerai. You mentioned that CYB was it was targeting Dio to some extent, but I think Viscerai was the other 100%. Big target that CYB decks were teching for, right? So Viscerai looking to be maybe slightly more positive from this band?
Yeah, I think Viscerai's got to be a big winner. I think, again, going back to why I played CYB Enigma at Worlds ultimately was the rise of Viscerai that we're hearing about. 100%, I just felt like that matchup was fairly poor without CYB, but with CYB was, I won't say close to a buy, but it honestly felt like it. So yeah, I think Viz has got to be in for being a big one. Also, the other thing as well is that Viscerai's probably worst matchup, or one of its worst matchups, is the other aggro decks, and I think Dasho getting some amount of hit is good for Viscerai. So I think for me, it's got to be, it's kind of tick on those two things of getting a bit of a buff there.
Yeah, high Octane being banned, definitely. I agree with you. Viscerai was worse into, I think was unfavored into Dio slightly, just because Dio's faster than you, and then also unfavored into Zen because of the Zen state thing. So yeah, getting a bit of equity in the other aggro matchup definitely helps as well, alongside the reduction in life gain on the Enigma side. But I'm curious, again, if more of them just start bringing Sigil of Solace now. And for a while, I know some Enigmas, not in the CYB versions, but in the regular versions, were trying to tech Arcane Polarity for the Viscerai matchup.
Yep.
So who knows if they try and pivot to other sources of life gain like that, because Aurora still exists, Aurora's still hanging around, and Viscerai's hanging around. We try and pivot to that as the slot in for the blue CYB. Maybe Viscerai doesn't quite come out on top. But yeah, I think on the whole, we can expect just a slight increase in equity for the hero.
Agree. Yep. Where next?
All right, next I'll talk about Aurora. So Aurora was my pick for best deck in format, and when you discussed this before Worlds, I still think she's best deck in format. I mean, I think she was already fine into the CYB decks if you had the tech for it, with the Poison the Wells. Now she might not even need to dedicate that. I think the one very clear example of this was the Rob Catton game against Gregorish in the quarterfinals, right? He lost the game by 3 extra damage, which it felt like, there were certain spots in the game where, say the Exude Confidence turn, if he had just pushed on that, if he read that the opponent was bricked on D-Rex, we pushed on that turn, the game kind of ends potentially differently. But also, all 9 CYBs were resolved that game, alongside the 3 Sisters of Solace. So now there's 3 fewer CYBs, 3 of the most potent CYBs fewer. Does Aurora, and he didn't have any of the tech. He didn't have Poison. Well, he didn't even have the combo package in the equipment, and that game was already that close. So does Aurora even need to tech anymore? I'm Like I think that question, the answer could very well be no. She doesn't need to attack anymore, and I think to me she's just gotten even more cemented as best deck in format, and also Dash.io thing as well. She was unfavored in Dash.io because she's slower than Dash.io, and Dash.io took a hit.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I agree. My view coming into World Championships is that the two best decks are Dash.io and Enigma. I don't think it was much of a secret in how I talked about them in each of the pods. And I said that I didn't see Aurora quite the same way that you were seeing it. Although I did admit that maybe I had a few blind spots. And the more I played Aurora, I do think the hero is very powerful. And it is top 3 deck in the format. I think one thing that's really interesting to me is that we had a really different take on the Aurora matchup to a lot of other people who played Enigma. We didn't think you could fatigue Aurora if they were set up. Even if they weren't, we felt that if the game didn't go quite your way and they were able to just pump out their combos early, like they just naturally drew their combo pieces early, so they naturally drew, say, 2 turns of Flicker and Arc Lightning, then you would just lose. So what we actually ended up doing, we played Reality Refractor, and we just tried to kill the Auroras. So I played 3 Aurora in the calling. I mean, 2-1. The one I lost was, I got double Flicker Wisp Arc Lightning very early on in the game. And so I think, again, we had a bit of a different approach. I think if people, their approach is still to try and fatigue because CYB is popular, then I think that's massive for Aurora. If people start to think, okay, how do I as Enigma beat Aurora? I'm not playing CYB, I'm a normal Enigma deck. And they land on things like Reality Refractor or other plans, I think that probably stays around the status quo. So I think, it's good for Aurora, all things considered, especially IO and somewhat CYB. Maybe in the end it actually becomes worse for them because they were pretty good into CYB. It was just a little bit hidden all along. I don't know. I think it's close. I just think Aurora wins, not as big as Viscerai though.
You speak about Enigma's tech and Aurora. I mean, I feel like the best way for Enigma to beat Aurora is to just try and hit them, to be honest, like Phantasmaclass and Pummel type stuff.
Mirage Metamorph, very efficient card for hitting Aurora.
Any other heroes you want to talk about for potential winners?
Just shout out. I wonder what happens with KO next. Does KO find a spot? The problem with KO, I think, in the last meta in particular, was that there was a bunch of other decks that were just too fast for you. Does the IO hit help you? And also CYB just being a strategy for Enigma, or a more prevalent strategy potentially, I think was tougher than non-CYB builds for a KO. Maybe it's nothing, and KO just still isn't powerful enough because there's still Aurora around, there's still Viscerai around, etc. And then the other one, just quickly shout out, is if CYB getting the hit means that just Enigma overall falls, Victor is really interesting. I think Victor was in a potential interesting spot for Worlds. It's one of those decks that you could have been like, all right, I just lose to Enigma, but I think I can beat IO, Aurora, and Viscerai. I'm going to build that way. And I had an eye on what might happen with Victor. I think I called it out in the preview pod. Ultimately, obviously, nothing happened with Victor, but if Enigma falls away even more, it's interesting to me.
It's funny you brought up KO, because I feel like the Dash.io hit actually hurt KO a little more than it benefited him. Because my take was that if KO wanted to beat Dash.io, they could. They have item destruction, right? And I feel like if they want to attack for the matchup, like it's easier for them to attack for that. But if we're thinking of Viscerai and Aurora potentially getting an upgrade because of these bans, I think those are the KO's bad matchups. So it felt like his matchup that he could potentially tech for got a little bit worse, and the matchups that got better because of it are his bad matchups. Was like my take.
I don't know, I think item destruction just sucks, but I mean,
fair enough. And then Victor, are these heavy hitters heroes? These heavy hitters heroes, man. I don't know. They're just fallen so far from both MSC and Rosetta coming out. I don't really believe in either of them.
I guess any kind of last things to say. I mean, we talked about losses as being Enigma. I mean, I wonder if Zen is a little bit of a loss potentially, because I think a lot of people thought that both a lot of people told me that both the IO and Enigma matchups are good. I didn't feel the same way about IO. I did feel the Enigma matchup was, depending on the builds, was pretty reasonable. So does Zen kind of lose out potentially if the meta shifts?
Potentially, this is so interesting. We're talking about losers here, and I think the two big ones that potentially people are thinking about is like Enigma and Nu, right? So like that was the CYB decks from the previous meta. But it's so weird because there are non-CYB builds of these heroes.
And they're both very powerful.
And they're both very, very strong. So are they actually losers, or are they just playing the other build, which is incredible in its own right? So it's like, sure, if you want to play CYB Enigma or CYB New, yeah, you took a hit on your power level. If you just play Enigma in general or New in general, you're kind of unaffected. Kind of depends, like, yeah, it depends, like, maybe how the mirrors go in that sense, right? If you're playing against a CYB, yeah, I don't, it's strange.
The answer could be there's no loser, right? Like, it's really interesting. The answer could be there's no real true loser apart from Dash.io, and actually what it all depends on is how the meta shakes out. So it all comes down to where does the meta shift from here? Oh, Viscerai gains in popularity for whatever reason. We saw Noah Bagelman have a fairly interesting build in top 8, and actually that kind of hurts Enigma because CYB is not as easy to play anymore. There's all these things, or actually, New gets hurt because Enigmas all move away from CYB and they know how powerful and strong that matchup can be, and now Enigmas are more teched again for New, and that means New's a loser. So there's less IO to prey on or whatever. Like, there's all these things that can mean that certain decks are losers and certain decks aren't. But I think what is more clear is that I think Viscerai and Aurora are probably the two biggest winners of this change.
And the Dash.io is a loser. So it's like, we can form the winners and losers from the high Octane ban.
Yeah.
And a CYB ban is a little harder.
Less clear. Less clear. Because I just think CYB hasn't completely worked out yet. Like, it had all that, there was a lot of, discussion on it when it first showed up, when Rosetta came out, and then it kind of died away, and then obviously it came back at Worlds, and people who thought it was good, and people who didn't think it was good, didn't think it was good. I think everyone has landed on, hey, it's actually pretty good, but what does it actually mean, and what does this ban mean? And I think that's going to be the thing that takes the longest time to figure out. And honestly, we might figure it out, and then all of a sudden it's back again. So who knows?
And speaking of not figuring it out, I mean, we spoke about Sigil Solace a few times already in this pod, but yeah, I think that's the other big question. Right? So many CYP lists just weren't running that card,
including me.
And now you kind of put it. Yeah, exactly.
Because I thought
Gregor's was actually one of Gregor's, I think, one of the few CYP lists I saw that actually had Sigil Solace in it. Most others just weren't on it. Like, we have enough life gain. So now it's like, it feels like those lists didn't change too much. Just swapped out the blues for the 3 sigils. We spoke about the life gain difference. It used to be 54. But if you put 3 blues CYBs as red sigils instead, you're down to 39.
Yep.
Which is a lot smaller. Yeah, like 54 to 30 is like, oh my god, that's like you almost cut it in half. But 54 to 39, it's kind of like, okay.
Nah.
It's like, yeah, but like, it's something good. So before we close it out, Hayden.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, did you have something you want?
No, I just think last thing on that is that the reason that people weren't on Sigil as being one that was on Sigil, we were on Sigil and then we cut it because it felt like you needed the spaces to be competitive into the Mirror or into Aurora. But Gregor's and people I think who played Sigil just went, actually, and even IO, to be honest, like he didn't play what I think is the best replacement for Sigil, which is the Essence of Ancestry. Red, which I think is the card that just was the default kind of go-to, and in a way, like, that really worked out for Gregor's, right? Like, dodge the Mirror, dodge IO to an extent, and beat up on everything else, and it went well. So yeah, anyway.
All right, so before we close it out, what's your take for current best deck / prediction for who's gonna win Calling Florence? Who being hero, not player?
Yeah. Enigma. I think Enigma's the best deck still.
Best deck I'm gonna win.
Yeah.
I think
Aurora.
I think Aurora's best deck. I'm with you that I think Enigma's gonna win Florence.
All right, sure. I think Enigma is the best deck, but I could see Aurora running Florence. So I think we can come to the conclusion that between the two of us, we think that Aurora and Enigma are the two best decks in the format. Is that fair?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. Well, with that said, I'm very interested to see what happens at Florence this weekend. I'm interested to see what happens at Portland next week, see if we'll have a new winning, potentially, in the hands of our dear friend here. But I'm also interested to see how the meta shakes out, and I'm really, really curious to see what impact Yao will have. I think the next 3 weeks are going to be fascinating. I think we have a lot to discuss, which we wouldn't usually post-World Championships, but there is going to be a lot to discuss, and I'm excited about that. Usually it's a bit of downtime in Fab, but it's just going to ramp up as we head into mid-December. So with that said, massive shout out to all the Arsenal Pass patrons. Just a reminder again, if you want to get your questions in for the Commander Cookout, please do so. If you want to follow us on X, you can find Pankaj here at Ethnic Smoke, me at Fian_Dale. If you want to send us an email, that's arsenalpassfab@gmail.com. I think I've hit all the socials. Follow us on YouTube, give us a like, subscribe, Spotify. You can rate and review us, all these good things. But until next week, we'll see you in the next pod.